Hi everyone, it's Monique again. I just want to take some time to go over your first set of slides. Not really in depth, like I said before, just kind of highlighting things you might have questions about. So, the first set of slides is on the study of human growth and development, and it highlights the history and how, like, back in the day, they kind of just looked at growth and development from like infancy up until like childhood, and that was it. But now we look at human growth and development on a continuum from the time that we are conceived until the time that we die, right? So the first like almost kind of complex thing that I really want to get into with you guys is the domains of development. So the domains of development, we look at those to kind of measure exactly what's going on. So we look at our physical development, we look at our cognitive development, and we look at our psychosocial development. With physical development, we're talking about like brain development, maybe like sicknesses, even just getting taller or losing weight, gaining weight, different things that have to do with our physical being, right? Our body. With our and also physical abilities as well. So like the ability to walk, you know what I mean? Things like that. Cognitive development highlights the mind and our thinking abilities and mental processes, things like that. And psychosocial development, it highlights, well, first, let me say this. You might hear me refer to it as social emotional development sometimes. Those can be used interchangeably, okay? So, that is going to highlight things such as how we get along with the world around us, how we get along with other people, our relationships with ourselves, right? So it's looking at all those interactions, our temperament, our personality, okay? So the next thing that your book or the slides go over is our social constructs. You might have also heard these being referred to as social constructions. Now, what a social construction is, or a social construct is it's very difficult to define. It's something that we all kind of just know as a society, but it's not like an official definition, okay? And it's not like a fact. Like, for instance, one of the big ones that come out are things like gender. Like, and we know that gender does not always match up with our sex, right? Also with race, that's another one that's huge because even like look at myself, somebody might say, oh, she's black, right? Somebody else might say, oh, no, she's black American. Somebody else might say, oh, no, she's African American. Somebody else might say, oh, no, she's American by way of Africa. Somebody else might go way down the line and, switch it up. So it really depends on who you are and how you're defining things. Another thing is constructs like adolescence, right? Things like middle-aged. Those are all new concepts that we're now discovering and going over and saying, okay, well, what does this mean, right? I might ask somebody to define adolescence and they might say, oh, it's from 12 to 18. Somebody else might say, oh, no, it's during your teenage years. Somebody might say, oh, it's after you start to menstruate or after your first nocturnal emission or whatever, right? So those things, we know what adolescence is, but we're not necessarily defining it. Even in terms of like education, that's another one that's big. Somebody might say, oh no, education is when you go to college and you do this, that, and the third. Somebody else might say, no, I was educated, I have street smarts. Or somebody might say, oh, well, my position's a little different. I was educated on how to farm and take care of my family, or even just like raising children, right? Virginity is another one that people will say, oh, I'm a virgin because I haven't done this, but maybe they've done that, So think about that and where you think about your own cultural biases and how we define things. And then there's also influences. And these are things that influence how we grow. Like they influence those domains of physical, cognitive, and psychosocial development, right? So these are things like heredity, which highlight our innate and our biological things that go on within us. things like environment, which looks at like our outside of ourselves and what goes on, right? That nurture, so that's nature versus nurture, right? Sound familiar? And then also maturation, and that's one that a lot of people don't necessarily know about, but it's when things happen at different times, right? So like for instance, um, maybe a girl got her period for the first time at 8 years old. Her reality and the way that she feels about her period is probably going to be very different from somebody who got their first period at 17 years old. You know what I mean? So just think about that. And those are both within normal range, right? So think about that and how maturation can have an influence on somebody, even like in terms of when we graduate. Imagine graduating at 14 versus 24. It's going to be very different, right? Culture is another thing that we talk about. I don't feel it's appropriate to shy away from topics of culture and everything else. Everybody brings a different culture to this class and this environment, and it's great. And so we're going to talk about it, right? And what is culture? It's a total way of life. So we might talk about, like when we get to death and dying, there's a lot of like, well, culturally we do this or culturally we do that, right? Or we might talk about the different foods that we're eating or customs, traditions, norms, things like that. Ethnic group is another thing that the first set of slides highlights. And this is something that's encompassed by a common ancestry, race, religion, language, nationality, or shared identity in some type of way. And we also have different influences, like the normative influences and non-normative influences. So just to break those down a little bit, normative influences are things that typically do happen in one's life, okay? Non-normative influences are things that don't typically happen in one's life, or either they are things that typically happen, but at atypical times. So for instance, something that doesn't typically happen in people's life is they do not get hit by a plane. But if somebody does, then that makes them special, right? I mean, it's not cool, but you know. Or they do not win. Most people don't win the lottery. But if they do, that's, you know, that makes them special, makes them unique. It's non-normative. Now, something that can be on the opposite end of that, where it could be something normative but happen at an atypical time, it might be somebody maybe conceiving a baby at 50 years old, right? Women don't typically conceive at that point in life, right? So that might be a little different. Or even maybe someone becoming famous, a famous singer at 14 years old, whatever. It's not something that typically happens. So just kind of think about that. Historical generation. That is when an entire generation of people go through something similar. Like the old version of this textbook talked about how like people who were in the Great Depression and people who were around for the World War II, how they had like this kind of Great Depression people were a little more stickler with their money, right? And the people who had been around for the war were more like they were just on the same page, just had like an understanding, and it didn't even talk about it. It was just an understanding that they had. But I mean, I'm looking around right now and I'm seeing a historical generation being built during COVID, right? So we're probably gonna come out of this with a lot more people wearing masks on a regular basis, right? Or other PPE, just like taking protective measures, washing hands more or whatever. Even like when you think about 9/11 and the things that came out of that, like it's the norm for me to go to the airport and just automatically, okay, I gotta take off my shoes, gotta do this, gotta do that, right? But that wasn't always the norm, was it? So historical generation, like our historical generation is saying, is part of that where that is just the norm. It's okay. It's no one even thinks twice about it, right? It might be like frustrating, like, oh man, I forgot to throw my water out or whatever it is at the airport, right? But it's not there's nothing to contest, right? And then also your slides highlight this idea of imprinting, which is when children or any organism kind of has an automatic willingness to learn when they're young and willingness to follow the adults around them and kind of learn from them, right? So it goes over Conrad Lorenz and his birds. So you guys can look into that a little more in depth, and I will post a video that will go over another child who didn't get that early on in her development. So I hope this helps. If you need anything from me, please, please, please reach out. All right.